So I'm Pedro Silva, and I'm going to be interviewing Dr. Peter Lantos. Do you believe that the strength you felt after the realization, and as you said, if I can survive this, I can survive anything, is it something that everyone that survived the Holocaust felt?
Well, I can't speak for everybody, but knowing people, there were different reactions. There were some people who felt the experience was so damaging, physically and psychologically, that they thought they would never recover. Being a child at the time, perhaps that fact helped me, but I always thought that my life should go on normally, as if it hadn't happened. But at the same time, it did, and I tried to incorporate that experience in my life. And I think I really felt that if I survived Bson, there would be hardly anything else which would be so daunting, so impossible, so cruel.
Thank you. About the decision you made to try to understand the German point of view, the German people's point of view, was it something that you believe everyone that survived the Holocaust should have given a chance to?
I think everyone probably had the chance, but there was a choice. At one extreme, there were people who never recovered from the experience. They never wanted to make peace with the Germans, and they hated them. Even those people who spoke fluent German, they didn't want to speak German, they wouldn't visit Germany, they wouldn't buy a German car. I was at the other extreme, because I don't know whether it was conscious or not, but even when I was a teenager, I wanted to understand the German mentality, what had led a civilized nation in the middle of Europe, in the middle of the 20th century, to set up a plan in which they killed in cold blood, planned ahead of time, 6 million people for the only reason because they had a religion. So that in a way, it practically meant that at high school, at the time, Russian was compulsory, but we could select choice, English, French, or German, and decided on the German. And I learned German, and I was 18. I spoke reasonably good German. And then when I was at the medical school, after a while we could travel. It was still Hungary, it was a one-party system, communist country in principle. We could travel only behind the Iron Curtain, but there was an exchange program between my medical university in Hungary and various socialist countries, including East Germany. So I wanted to go to East Germany, and when I was 21, my first foreign trip after the second, because the first was to Bson, the second trip led to East Germany, made friends with medical students, young doctors, and that is how it evolved. And when I graduated, I collaborated with German scientists and physicians.
How was it like going to a school with a Soviet curriculum?
Well, it was, I started in a different system. My mother took me to a Catholic school because that was the best in the town. And that end of 48 became a state school. So I had all my studies, including the high school, until 80s in state school. I have to say that apart from the political content, and certain things had been rewritten, like history, the standard of teaching was very good. And there were very good teachers, and we had very hard work, had to do hard work, homework, and exams. So I think I really had a good education in Hungary, although, as I mentioned, certain subjects like history, literature, had been somewhat altered according to the political dogma.
And do you think that at the time everyone understood that the changes to the news and the, well, history itself was obvious propaganda.
Yes, I mean it was obvious to everybody at the school, and we could read between the lines, and some of the teachers also kind of nodded because it was acknowledged that certain things, and we did know that they were not true, as indeed the news was completely biased.
Now I would like to ask a couple of questions on Bson itself. When you were in Bson, do you remember any details of the specific camp you were in, the camp for Hungarian Jews?
I remember obviously detailed the time of when we arrived. It was a place I never seen before. I remember the barracks, these low buildings where we stayed. I remember the 3-tier bunks on which or in which we had to sleep. I remember the food, I remember the cold, and I remember the barrenness of the place. So as that obviously as a child I remembered. And what in a way is the most striking remembrance is the physical hardship, that I was hungry all the time. I was cold all the time, most of the time, because we arrived on the 7th of December and left on the 6th of April. And that most of the time it was bitterly cold and standing in the freezing wind, washing into ice-cold water. So these are things which actually I do remember.
What was the language of interaction between the inmates?
Well, we were what is called a Hungarian camp. So most of the people in that particular area of Bergen-Belsen, Bson was enormous. That was mainly Hungarian. And then the interaction with the Germans was depending. My mother could speak German, and many people speak or spoke German, because the second foreign language in Hungary, as a result of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was the German language. So my mother could speak German. So that was the second interaction with the German. But most of the inmates in that area spoke Hungarian.
What sort of attitudes do you remember that the SS soldiers had?
Well, they were obviously not very friendly, to say the least. If you tried to avoid them, everybody did. And there were obviously certain events when they showed their cruelty. But they were somewhat removed because it was very cleverly done. The German appointed elder prisoners they could trust. So in a way, the interaction between the German guards and the inmates, it was not very frequent. It was actually those Hungarians who were appointed to be the person responsible for a particular barrack with whom we had to react to.
What sort of expectations did you and the people around you have when, after the train you were in was liberated by the Americans and they accommodated you in Hillersleben?
Well, obviously it was an entirely different world. There was still an element of uncertainty. The war still was going on, as that was the date we were liberated by the Americans, was 13th of April, 1945, 2 days before the British officially liberated Bson. And we didn't know what would happen. There was an element of uncertainty. Next day we were taken to Hillersleben, and we had a reasonably good life, but everyone actually wanted to go home. And we didn't know what would happen next. Then the war ended, and that area of Germany became the part of the Soviet zone of occupation, which later became the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany. And the Russians were not very well organized, and my mother was desperate to get home, and we escaped and got on goods train to Prague, and from Prague back to Budapest. And the expectation of my mother was that she would find my elder brother, who was 14 years my senior, alive. He had been taken to hard labor. He returned to Hungary and had typhoid fever, which was misdiagnosed in the local hospital, and died a week or so before we arrived. And that was a terrible kind of event for my mother, who practically never recovered from my brother's death. And then we learned that altogether 21 members of my family perished in the Holocaust, both on my father's side and on my mother's side. There were 8 siblings, so it was a large family. Some survived, but 21, including my grandmother, 7, and my cousin, 5, they had been murdered.
Was the happiest memory of that time the moment in the train station in Prague with the Red Cross workers?
Well, that was a happy moment, but the happiest moment was, apart from the idea, because even I understood that we were free when the Americans arrived. I mean, it was a terrifying moment because we didn't know what was going to happen. The train had been bombed, which were traveling from Bson towards Prague, because the Allies thought that the train was carrying German soldiers, because there were anti-aircraft guns on the train which had been used, aimed at the low-flying American and or British planes. But we haven't been hit directly, and arrived. And when the American arrived, that even I considered it something. It's ended because the uniforms were different, and I knew that, I understood, didn't understand, but the sound of German was familiar, and the language those soldiers spoke was different, and they have different uniforms. My mother said they are American. So that was probably unconsciously, but physically, the happiest moment was when I had a large piece of chocolate from the American soldiers.
That's very nice. Now, having lived through these indescribable and unimaginable moments in history, what piece of advice could you give to the world in this moment of our civilization?
Well, it's very difficult. I'm not a prophet to give such an advice, but I mean, the idea of talking about the Holocaust is perhaps to say that we ought to do something that it doesn't repeat itself, not just Jews, but to any religion, any minority, anywhere in the world. We ought to learn from it, but occasionally I feel, because following events more recently, that it hasn't been actually learned. I think that it's very important that we don't accept intolerance, xenophobia, the dislike of minorities, whatever the basis for it is, whether it's religion, gender, political views. We ought to be more understanding. And I think that the big idea would be to try to understand those people whose idea is farthest from our own. It's very easy if you and I agree, but it's more difficult to understand you if you have completely different views. And that is what I think we should have a bridge to learn, why your view is different, and it's not necessarily worse than mine.
When you met Professor John Hinson in Newcastle, what kind of differences in perspective did you both have of Bson, him as an outsider and you as more of an insider?
Well, in a way, to some extent, he became an insider because they arrived, people were still dying. So he could see actually what happened. His view was that of a medic. I mean, he didn't qualify, but it was just the year before. So they were all, the medical students were senior at 1 year before qualifying. And he saw what happened. So when I met him, he was quite moved, describing, and he did write an article which I read. That is how actually I realized that John Hinson, who did write the article, he is the same man whom I knew from medical conferences for many years, and we established obviously a rapport. And it was interesting to read the articles written by medical students, because many of them did write about their experience in Bson, in the house journal of their medical school at the time. Each London medical school, of which there were 12 at the time, had their separate journals. So John Hinson did write an article in the Journal of St. Mary's Hospital Medical School, and this is, I found out from the medical register, that he graduated at Mary's. So it was clear that I have the same person in Bson helping after liberation, and the colleague whom I met several times. And that is the reason when I did write the letter, that we were actually at the same place, and we nearly could have met, because they arrived a few days after we had left. So there was, in a way, a very interesting day.
And the pocket watch that Professor Hinson gave you, what does it mean to you?
Well, it means, in a way, I don't have objects which kind of from Bson. And that is probably the single most important one I have. And it's a very beautiful watch. Obviously, it didn't work when I got it. So I took it to a jeweler in Regent Street, Mappin and Webb. They said, sorry, we don't repair watches, but if you go to John Walker in South Audley Street, then he may repair it, and he did. So I have a functioning watch from Bson, which is in my bedroom on the bureau, and I treat it as a friend.
What was the procedure like to request an exit visa out of a communist regime?
Exit visa from Hungary?
Yes.
Well, at the time, I had a passport with which, in principle, one could travel anywhere in Europe. In the mid-60s, the system became more liberal. You could apply for a passport, and I was amazed. When I was still a medical student, I got a passport with which one could travel to the West. And it was such a novelty that other medical students came to look at it, because no one saw a passport of that type. But there was a snag. If one wanted to travel to the West, you just couldn't get the air ticket and get on the plane and fly out. You had to have an exit visa or a permission from the police to go to the West. So when I applied to go to England on a welcome fellowship in 1966, they said no. And there was no question asking why not. The answer was apply next year. I applied in 67, the answer was no. And applied being persistent in 1968, they said yes. So that was the procedure, and it was interesting because when I went to pick up the passport with the approval, the policeman, who we knew actually was in charge of looking after the university, even now I remember his name, asked, have you been to the British Embassy? And I said, yes, twice. They didn't know the dates when I visited the embassy. So we were so carefully watched by the police that it was known to them when I visited the British Embassy.
So you were under the scrutiny of the regime while waiting for the visa?
Not personal, but they wanted to know who goes to the British embassy. And I learned the fact from someone who is a diplomat who knew the Budapest embassy. He told me that there is a opposite embassy from which they moved out now, the Brits, that opposite the embassy there was there still is a large office building. The top floor of that building was rented by the police with cameras, and they photograph everybody going to the British embassy. I know it for a fact. So they didn't know when I visited.
How did the Hungarian population, the Hungarian citizens that did not go to any camps, react to or dealt with the return of Jewish Hungarians after their liberation?
It was not the same for everybody. There were people who were extremely helpful. Someone, for instance, hid some jewelry for the family, which were returned, and I have the document which my mother said that Mrs. X kept and returned this and that. But there were people actually who said more Jews came back than they were deported. They felt that those who survived shouldn't have survived. So there was this anti-Semitic feeling. So it was not, the reactions were very, very different. And I tend to think that those who were helpful and sympathetic were the majority, but I'm not sure.
Finally, looking back at the unfortunate events that you have witnessed, and given the rise in conflicts that we have come to see across the globe, and especially in Europe, what are your thoughts on the expression or the saying that history tends to repeat itself?
Well, I'm not sure whether it repeats itself, and I hope that certain events not going to repeat themselves. But that, in a way, the answer I try to give, that the remembering what happened, perhaps we should learn from it and prevent things happening again. It is very disappointing what's happening now in Europe. When communism collapsed, I thought that Europe will be a single kind of entity, and what was the Soviet Union, that part, Russia, will be part of Europe. And we are not going to experience what is happening now, an even more vicious second Cold War between the West and Russia. So occasionally I feel that we actually haven't learned from the past, and history repeats itself. But I don't think that we should end on a pessimistic note, because in a way we are living in a much better world, those privileged people who are in free and liberal countries.
Thank you. That's it.
You are welcome.